So that's what happened when they ran away that day to get married. And they did wait. And Father Coyle was reached by his assistant pastor. And he did make it back into Birmingham in time to marry the two of them. Now, Father James Coyle, who was the presiding priest of St. Paul's, was by this day easily the most famous Catholic in the state of Alabama at this time. He was famous because, unlike many other Catholics during this period, who preferred to keep their heads low during this period of extreme anti-Catholicism, Father James Coyle was different. He became famous because he was willing to stand up in defense of his faith. And he wrote many, many letters to the editors of the local papers to correct errors that were being said routinely about Catholics and his faith in the community and elsewhere in the country. And because of that, he was very visible within the state. People knew him, and many people who took anti-Catholic views despised him. So later on that day, not long after he took the vows of Ruth Stevenson and Pedro Guzman, when he was sitting on the porch of the rectory, and Ruth Stevenson's father walked up to that porch, the feeling that Father Coyle must have had about his arrival, Stevenson's arrival, must have been one of fear. But we can't know that for sure because of what would happen on the steps of that porch. So let me give you an idea of let me just set this up, and then I'll read you another passage that describes that moment. When Stevenson arrived at that porch, what happened there would be contested in months to come. But there were some things that were absolutely clear. One thing was that he arrived carrying a loaded gun. He fired 3 shots from that gun, and one of his bullets entered the left temple of Father Coyle and quickly led to his death that day. So let me read you this passage about who was around at the moment that those shots were fired. Birmingham traffic officer W.L. Snow was standing in the middle of the intersection of 3rd Avenue and 21st Street, guiding traffic when he heard the shots. Even at that late hour, cars continued to choke the busy intersection, and Officer Snow was doing what he could to maintain order. Not long before, at the other end of the block, 2 cars had collided. Snow did not want the same thing to happen on his watch. The city government had responded to the growing traffic problems of Birmingham by adding police officers specifically assigned to traffic direction and control. In 1921, the city stationed 18 of those traffic officers at the busiest intersections of the downtown district. The measure was not a complete solution, but city officials hoped that it would provide relief to the most hopelessly congested areas. By the end of the decade, the numbers of traffic officers grew to nearly 60 as the glut of motor cars that clogged key downtown intersections reached a crisis level. The city's traffic code reflected the strain as well, growing heavier by the year and including for the first time provisions for one-way streets, new parking restrictions, speed limits, and restrictions on the popular jitney, whose nimbleness made safety and congestion a constant concern. Without warning, the sound of gunshots exploded around traffic officer Snow, drowning out the competing sounds of traffic. One shot, followed rapidly by another, a momentary pause, then a third, all from the direction of the Catholic Church 1 block away. Officer Snow looked toward the church, confused, as a small flock of pigeons darted into the air and out of sight. Who would be shooting at pigeons, Officer Snow wondered, but when he heard a woman scream, he ran. Snow reached the front of the Jefferson County Courthouse in just a few seconds. Dick Gale, who was standing in the street, pointed wildly at the courthouse, shouting, "There he goes!" Dick had bolted after the shooter as soon as he stepped down from the porch and began to stride away. Dick reached the corner of the courthouse just as the gunman turned inward along the building's east wall. Officer Snow came running from the opposite direction. Dick Gale gestured to the police officer to let him know that the retreating man had moved along the side of the courthouse. It must have been a relief to relinquish his pursuit. Unlike Dick Gale, the officer had a gun. If the shooter had any ideas of any more violence, at least it would be a fair fight. Still running, Officer Snow slid his gun from its holster, vaguely aware that another officer, Officer Weir, had fallen in behind him. The gunman, dressed in black, had climbed the stairs on the right side of the courthouse, turned the corner on the building, and moved out of sight. The officers tore up the stairs, Officer Snow in the lead. When Snow reached the landing and rounded the corner, the man was jerking at the knob of a door. It was locked. He turned back toward the officers, outnumbered and trapped. The man moved slowly then, as if aware that the officers might feel threatened by the gun he still gripped in his hand. But Snow had a wife and children at home, and he took no chances. He leveled his gun on the man's chest. "That's all right, gentlemen," the gunman said evenly. "I know what I'm doing. I want to be locked up." "Put your gun down, then," Snow replied coolly, keeping his gun squared at the man's chest. The gunman lowered his arm, and Officer Weir stepped forward and pulled the gun from his hand while Officer Snow took hold of him. The prosecutor asked Snow later about the gun's caliber, but looking back through the haze of adrenaline, the officer could not be sure. Either a .38 or .45, he answered, uncertain. Definitely an automatic. The officer was sure of one thing. It was big, Snow remembered grimly. And so that gives you a little bit of a sense of who was around on 3rd Avenue when the shots were fired. This was on a busy downtown street, and there were many witnesses. And so you might think that that would mean that the prosecutor's later job of bringing Reverend Edwin Stevenson to justice for shooting Father James Coyle that day would be a relatively easy task, because there were many witnesses who came forward to tell the prosecutor what had happened, what they had seen, what they had heard on that day. But almost immediately it became clear that this case was going to be different from many of the other homicide cases that this prosecutor, a veteran prosecutor named Joe Tate, had handled already in his career. Joe Tate began to see signs right away that the case against Stevenson was going to be at least hotly contested. One of the earliest signs was that the grand jury that Joe Tate asked to indict the case, to bring the formal charge against Stevenson that was necessary even to bring him to trial, was uncharacteristically slow in responding to his request. Now, that's a really unusual thing. Prosecutors don't normally have trouble with grand juries, and one reason for that is that prosecutors aren't up against an opponent in a grand jury. They're in the room of the grand jury by themselves. And there's a famous saying today that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich if she wants one. But that was not the case in 1921 in Birmingham, when Joe Tate went into the grand jury and asked a group of men to indict their neighbor, Reverend Edwin Stevenson, for first-degree murder. Eventually, the grand jury did indict Stevenson and for murder, But the indictment that they returned was for second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder, which was premeditated murder and would have carried a death sentence potentially if he had been convicted of that. And so that was one of the earliest signs that this case would be contested. Another problem that the prosecutor noticed right away was that his star witness, his intended star witness, Ruth Stevenson herself, was quickly being vilified in the press, the local press of the time. This story was a national sensation at the time that it occurred. Although anti-Catholicism was a very common thing during this period, as I said, it was also no everyday event that a Methodist minister would shoot and kill a Catholic priest over the marriage of his 18-year-old daughter. And so the newspapers across the country picked up on this story, and they followed it from the day of the shooting through the conclusion of the trial of Edwin Stevenson later in October of 1921. And many of those news reports focused on Ruth Stevenson and her decision to defy her parents' wishes and to marry Pedro Guzman against their advice. And many of them also began reporting about Ruth Stevenson's earlier attraction to Catholicism. She had been interested in converting to Catholicism for some years. She, in fact, had a couple of months before she married Pedro, had secretly converted to Catholicism. She slipped away and she was baptized a Catholic against her parents' wishes in May of this same year. She kept it a secret from her parents as long as she could, but eventually they found out about it. And some pretty horrific things happened inside of her household as her father attempted to convince her that even if the law gave her the right to choose her own religion once she turned 18, that didn't mean that her family, that her father in particular, was going to be accepting of her decision to abandon her rightful religion. And so she subsequently told of beatings that she took from her father as he made her promise that she would not go forward with her intention of being a Catholic. And so all of that happened shortly before the day that she decided to marry Pedro. So the newspapers were beginning to report about this. In particular, the newspapers in Alabama, this is the biggest story of the day. Pedro and Ruth were front page news. And so she was being vilified in the press because the reporters of the day, like her parents, couldn't understand any of the decisions that she made. Why? When Catholicism was so hated in the country, would she be attracted to it? Why would she defy the good guidance of her parents in the way in which that she did? This was also a time where you could see in those news reports the powerful patriarchal and gender expectations of the day. Young girls, daughters of the South, were expected to follow the instructions of their parents, particularly their fathers. And so Ruth's defiance was seen as, indefensible rebellion, teenage rebellion by this 18-year-old. And that's the way that she was being characterized in the press accounts of her. So that didn't bode well for the prosecutor either. And finally, one of the things that began to happen right away was that the Ku Klux Klan began to circle the wagons around Reverend Edwin Stevenson and to raise money for his defense. They had enormous success at doing it. They ran fundraising drives across the state of Alabama and easily raised all the money that was needed to pay for his lawyers, and they hired his lead attorney, a young man at that time named Hugo Black.